All right.
We're live.
All right. Hi. How are you, Mtwale, today? How's been the weekend?
Thank you very much, Vernon. I'm good. And well, the weekend has passed. It was good.
Mhm.
And it is now time to focus on the next phases of our lives. And that, Vernon, is now focusing on what is in front of us. That is our next session here of Behind the Markets.
Yeah.
It is the week, it is the final 2 days of the month of February, the second month. If you're still practicing your habits, and you're
Mhm.
still doing them strongly, then I must say to you, congratulations. You are managing to break through the drop off. That's going to be the big battle, breaking through the drop off of the rest of the year. So today, I really want to focus today on Mindset Monday, Vernon, on two things. The main two things today being the inflation, the global inflation comparison. And I know we usually go through the markets, but today I just want to put our minds into a certain gear as we're facing the troubles that we are as a country. While I want us to also talk about something dear to me, Vernon, that is what I call the path to proficiency. This month I've really been talking about trying to become good at something. Focusing on being good at something, focusing on not just being good at something, being phenomenal at something, being great at something. That is what I want us to really, really pour our minds on today, Vernon. But today, let's just kick off on something I would like to try and have a conversation about. It is obviously the last Monday. Thank you very much to one of our listeners, Priscilla. Thank you very much. It is the last Monday of February 2023. We will have no more Mindset Mondays that are linked towards February 2023. It's not the end of Mindset Mondays, but is the end of the Mondays of 2023. Now, the there has been a lot of hurt, Vernon, about inflation in Zambia, especially the cost of food. The most persistent part of inflation generally has been the inflation story of Zambia in terms of the cost of food. And today, I want to just really break through that conversation. But first and foremost, my brother, I want to strictly have a quick roundup also before we get into that. Also, sorry to everyone, I did miss that point. I really do want to have a quick roundup of trade data in Zambia, and I'll go through it in a bit more detail. Sorry about that. There's a bit of feedback happening. I want to just quickly go through trade data in Zambia. That came out due to the trade statistics that did follow the inflation statistics that came out last week on Thursday. And one of the biggest pieces of news that has come out is that Zambia has come back to a very strong trade surplus. In fact, the strongest trade surplus that it has had in over 10 months. So in US dollars, we actually had a trade surplus of $326 million. And that is a way to start the year. But unfortunately, this is still 3% below the trade surplus that we had last time. And this is majority driven by the trade, by the increase in output or the increase in price of copper. So as you can see right here on our chart here, that part of the preliminary news coming out of trade data, which we will go into in much more depth coming out later, is trade surplus of $326 million, as you can see, for January 2023, after we faced the first trade deficit after a continuous slide. So we are back to the highest trade surplus since March 2022. And this is because of the highest copper export since May 2022. So that has actually given us a very strong trade surplus, even in the face of even in the face of very strong and persistent rising consumer goods imports. We actually had very, very strong consumer goods numbers, showing that the Zambian consumer is coming back with a bit of veracity. And we had quite big strength in the consumer goods sector, where we had an 88% growth in consumer goods imports, $272 million worth of consumer goods. This, by the way, we're going to give you very quickly, is what we call the map of trade. It's our very quick, it's a very brief infographic that we always give that shows you the map of where trade was actually occurring. And if you look here, you can see that we had $383 million worth of non-traditional exports this month for the month of January 2023, leading up to $1 billion worth of export. Now, export really did come back 16.9% higher than it was last year in January. We had $1 billion worth of export, and 35% rise, obviously, month on month from from December. So you can see we had a strong rebound in export that drove us. So look at export as a signal that there is a little bit of growth coming back. And mainly this was driven by a 40% jump up in copper earnings from the last month. And it is 2.6% lower than where this was last year, but that was mainly due to the price of copper more than anything. The output of copper actually bounced back quite strongly above 70,000 with a $9,000 price. So we do actually have some semblance of strength in the copper market. So that's something that we're looking forward to. What you're also seeing there is that non-traditional exports are still very strong. If you take a look at the non-traditional export numbers, you'll see here that non-traditional exports up $381 million, but especially non-agricultural, non-traditional exports, they were up 41% from the previous month and 95% up from this month last year. $310 million of non-traditional, non-agricultural exports. And the agricultural exports, though they were down 12% from the previous month because of record numbers in December, what we did see is that agricultural exports are still up 79% from the previous year. Remember that we're on track for $2 billion of agricultural export probably by the year 2026 or 2027. That's going to be good for diversification of our economy and also good for growing our agricultural sector of the economy. But if you take a look also at raw materials imports, we managed to see a slowdown in raw materials importing down to $72 million. We saw a slowdown in intermediary goods. Obviously, that is a January effect. There's less productivity. And also we've seen a strong slowdown in capital imports. In other words, capital goods. The main thing that juiced up the economy was the consumer good imports. Consumer goods, even in the height of the FX rate that was really losing steam, we saw 63% increase in consumer goods imports and 88% increase in year-on-year consumer goods imports. That is also a sign, ironically, of the recovery of the Zambian consumer. The Zambian consumer, therefore, is actually picking up steam, and therefore they are actually importing, because when they're importing, it means they're purchasing a lot more. Or it actually means that it either means we're purchasing a lot more, or it means that our production is actually declining. Now, remember, we had a PMI reading in January that actually showed a positive bounce back of 50.3. So in other words, this means that with our production back and our consumers running strong, it actually means that there's signs that our economy is actually switching on a bit stronger. Those are signs. Those are not exactly the meanings of it. And I know it's hard to say that, obviously, with the conversation about inflation rising so strong. But this is our January 2023 monthly inflation trade data in US dollars, showing that we had a surplus of $326 million of trade surplus in January, showing that we are having a recovery, at least signs of a recovery. Should we see this continuing for a few more months, we should be seeing signs of a recovery and a recovering economy in copper. Now, the good thing about seeing $748 million of copper imports, that means that taxes stemming from copper will be strong. So this little information here is actually a good sign for our currency, that should it continue, it means withholding taxes will improve. And it also means that we'll see an improvement. Withholding taxes that come, sorry, not withholding taxes, mineral royalties that we're able to start to improve, and also potentials for corporate profits. So if there's stronger exports, you start to see stronger profit taxes coming out of the copper industry. So that is the data that we've picked up from trade. This is the summary of trade today, and we're going to leave that down for everyone. We'll be going into that in much stronger details when it comes to it. But big headline news is we have seen a trade-related recovery we have seen a trade-related recovery and also consumer goods, and with $326 million trade surplus. Now, Vernon, I wanted to share a thing regarding the story of inflation. That's one of the biggest stories when it comes to today. And this is the thing regarding the story of inflation. And one of the first things I will point out is that Zambia is currently on 11.6% food inflation. But of course, month on month food inflation is currently sitting somewhere between 2.8 and 1.9%, really sitting somewhere around 2.3%, meaning year on year, we might see food inflation that can actually push as high as 30% if we're not careful. Okay, so we really have to make sure we go through the food valleys, the inflation valleys quite well, and make sure we have some output. Now, my biggest concern of this year is the amount of floods and the adverse weather that we faced, which means that the crop output is actually in danger this year. So there is a stern worry that we have to think about when it comes to food inflation going through this year, and whether we're going to have subdued food inflation or whether we're going to see food inflation getting into the higher teens, getting into the 20s. And that's when we should all start to be very, very deeply concerned as to what direction we're going when it comes to this. But the first signals I would give you is food inflation. And food inflation is sitting at around 11%. Remember, mainly due to the slowdowns in meat inflation, the slowdowns in vegetable inflation. Those are the main areas where we're seeing slowdowns in poultry inflation. But we are still seeing strong inflation data in areas such as in what I call the milli-meal sector. And just to give you a quick idea right here, here's what I mean when I say the milli-meal sector. These are the inflation figures, which I'm going to show you right now. These are the inflation figures of milli-meal prices on average over the last 3 months and what inflation rates have been looking like, especially in the milli-meal sector. And as you can see in December, we saw milli-meal inflation of 32.21%, 28.66% by January, and 29.31%. We're getting sticky inflation in the milli-meal sector, somewhere around 29.9% in terms of the year-on-year inflation. In fact, last month we had a 7% increase in the price of milli-meal products. Whether it's roller meal, maize itself. So these maize meal or milli meal products are actually up on an average about 29% year on year. And last month they were up 7.4%. So it's actually quite elevated inflation that we're dealing with, especially in this sector. It's actually quite strong and persistent. Now, the reason why we have to have this conversation is because this is one of the key drivers of food inflation, if not the main driver of food inflation. Now, Zambian food inflation, yes, it is high, but you have to understand that it is a global phenomenon. And I know people hate that terminology because, unfortunately, it was wrongly used before. And now it's anytime someone says something is global, we automatically have suspicion arousing to it. So let's let the data speak for it. And what is the other countries in the world looking at when they're seeing food inflation? Well, let me show you. This is compiled by the World Bank. And here are food inflation statistics coming from some other economies around the world. If you take a look here at the top, Zimbabwe, year-on-year food inflation already, and this is the latest data that Zimbabwe has, 285%. Okay, cost of food has risen in Zimbabwe. Okay, 285%. Just take a very close look at what that means. Venezuela, which has always been in a mess, 158% year-on-year food inflation. Lebanon, 143% food inflation. Argentina, 95% food inflation. Turkey, 77% food inflation. Let's bring this a bit closer to home. Ghana, 60% food inflation. Sri Lanka, 59% food inflation. Rwanda, the nation that we always hold in such high regard, 59% food inflation. Suriname, 55%. Haiti, 53%. I'm going to add a few more names to this. We have seen some food inflation statistics also coming out from some other countries. And if you take a look at the lead African countries, Egypt is currently facing 48% food inflation. Nigeria, which is in the middle of its elections, is currently facing 24% food inflation. Kenya is on 13% food inflation, and so is South Africa, also on 13% food inflation. So already you're seeing that when it comes to food inflation, the world is struggling. Africa is really, really struggling. Okay, they're really, really starting to struggle when it comes to food inflation. So if you want to take a look at Zambia's 11.6% year-on-year food inflation, though yes, our milli meal prices are up 29%, perhaps it'll do us good to look in the context of some of these things. Even things like cooking oil prices. Cooking oil prices are even in South Africa are sitting at around 18.1% in terms of inflation of cooking oil prices. So food prices world round are suffering astronomically with high costs, especially with the logistics of getting food to the developing world. That is where there's huge problems. We are importing quite a lot of food, and trying to get it into the developing world is causing problems. That's one. Two, there's also the issues of fertilizer. Most food requires growing. So fertilizer costs around the world, and fertilizer, remember, last year had an inflation of 256% in US dollars. Okay. So fertilizer is already 3 times the price it was the year before, already coming into last year, and therefore that has fed into the price of these crops. So fertilizer prices are the second problem that we're facing. Remember, we're not producing fertilizer. And this is why I keep saying we must consider alternatives and just bringing in factories. And I know that's a good thing that always has to be announced, but we have alternatives. We have an industrial hemp act, which is supposed to help us produce fertilizer, because industrial hemp in its state can actually potentially bring down the cost of fertilizer over 50%. And therefore, that affects the cost of growing food. And therefore, that makes food much easier to grow, because the biggest barrier we're facing in growing food in the most cost effective fashion, yes, number one is weather patterns, but number two is organic fertilizer. And I'm actually seeing here even somebody bringing this out. Manure or organic approach. This is Howard Hastings. Thank you very much for bringing this out. And this is what we keep trying to talk about. The organic fertilizer industry is extremely important for us to start working on. Not just any old fertilizer, but the organic fertilizer. And that is the main reason we have for passing the Industrial Hemp Act. And there are actually players ready on the ground trying to get this going. That it appears that whatever thing is going on in the back office, which has led to that act sitting in the back benches, is creating a huge problem for us to be able to handle our food supply chain. The second problem, obviously, is the adverse weather conditions that we're facing, especially consistent floods, which are washing out crops. These two things, floods and fertilizer, are the biggest danger to containing food prices in Zambia. The other danger, which we're looking at, is all these inflation reads coming from neighboring countries as high as Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, all these countries, DRC. When they are facing heightened levels of food inflation, you have to bear in mind that they need your food. Okay, so they are going to be demanding your food. And if you want to ask yourself a question, why is there smuggling when it comes to maize? In fact, one of our stories, our 5 things to know today, has been that there's had to be a lot of border patrol because of the amount of smuggling that we're facing as a country when it comes to maize. Well, one of the reasons they're smuggling is because these people know that Zambia grows food at a decent cost in comparison to them. Okay, so what are they doing? They're trying to get food out of your country and into their country. So therefore, there is an incentive to smuggle. And the other thing you have to understand is that where there is high food inflation, that means there's often insufficient demand or unmet demand. So if you're looking at, let's say, Malawi, okay, you're trying to say, well, why are we smuggling maize into Malawi? Well, perhaps take a little brief moment and study what they're seeing in terms of food inflation. Malawian food inflation at the moment is 31.3%. Okay, I want you to look at that very carefully. Malawian food inflation is currently 31.3% versus your 11.6% year on year. So already Malawians are really struggling with trying to get food at decent cost. And they've been really battling with 30% food inflation since June 2022. So there is an incentive to take cheaper. It is not cheap to us, but cheaper maize from where we are here and try and get it across the border to the place where they're willing to pay a much higher price for it. So if you're wondering why we're then smuggling maize across, it's because of the price differentials between Zambia. As you're complaining that this is expensive, trust me, it is much more expensive for other countries. Why then are we seeing, well, we constantly seeing DRC food inflation as well. DRC food inflation, now it's been relatively contained for a period of time, but they've managed to keep it at around 6%. That's why the story you keep hearing now is Malawi. So DRC has faced its food inflation, but obviously this is the last read that they had only at the middle of the year, at the middle of last year. But if you're trying to look at, as I said, at inflation numbers in some of your surrounding countries, it's going to push out smuggling. And what does smuggling do when there's limited supply? Is that it decreases supply and increases the cost to the domestic sector. And I call this export-driven demand. So an export-driven demand squeeze, which pushes prices up. So what people need to start looking at very carefully, okay, is how we can, one, ramp up our production so that we're not battling our export markets, but we are heavily supplying our export markets. And we're doing this profitably, okay? We want to have such a great oversupply, but that requires managing our domestic fertilizer markets. Okay, and that is why I keep saying that the change should actually be part of this change, should actually be looking at the organic fertilizer sector very carefully as a way to try and remove as a way to try and remove the struggles that we're dealing with. And that is why I've kept on talking about things like the Industrial Hemp Act. Why are we not enacting it to make sure that we improve the fertilizer supply chain? And why have we kept so quiet on it? Why have we made this into a pariah issue? Because one, the moment you talk about hemp, everyone thinks you're talking about smoking weed. And that is not the case that people are talking about. Nobody's talking about smoking weed. People are just talking about hemp. People are just talking about hemp in terms of utilizing it for its industrial purposes, because you cannot smoke hemp, people. No matter what you want to be told, you cannot smoke hemp. Okay, you can only utilize it, and specifically utilize it in the three areas of major import which are weakening our currency, which is food, which is fertilizer, fabric, and fuel. These are three areas: fertilizer, fabric, and fuel. The ethanol that we need to blend with the semi-finished products is made from hemp stalks that can actually be made very well from hemp stalks in order to contribute to reducing the to reducing the oil costs. The very fertilizer, which is costing us a lot to grow our food, can be made from industrial hemp, bringing down the cost of fertilizer and the fertilizer in use from a potential 1,000 that we're facing down to about a third of the cost, actually, because of the increased variety. Speak to the people in the industry. They'll actually break this down for you so that you understand the importance of organic farming. There are plenty of people who are trying to promote organic farming. And we're not talking about trying to farm weed. We're talking about actually trying to farm something that will help bring us fertilizer and also fabric. Okay, we need fabric for clothing, people. And if you actually look at it, by investing in your hemp sector, you can actually reduce your fabric imports and then transition to that, especially for things like school uniforms, materials, industrial uniforms, farm uniforms, mining attire. This stuff can be built utilizing industrial hemp, whether it's army uniforms, police uniforms, all these things. And therefore, it can be made domestically. So these are three key areas that produce billions, by the way, of dollars in imports at the end of every year. And we can actually try and go after it and reduce these impacts, especially to our currency, especially at a time when we've had softer demand for copper. Even though it's recovering now, we've had softer demand for copper. And these, for the life of me, are the proactive stances. I don't understand why we don't take them. Okay, when this has been staring us in the face as an opportunity to better our country. Anyway, however, I did actually bring this up mainly due to the inflation conversation, the food inflation conversation, to tell you that those inflation figures are going to tell you one of two things. I'm going to tell you a couple of things. One, this is not the end for food prices. As long as your neighbors are facing high levels of inflation like this and you're still underproducing, that means the demand that's going to squeeze down from neighboring countries is going to force the prices of a lot of things up, because everybody would still rather export. So yes, we're seeing people with expired export licenses hustling things along the border, but even the people who legitimately grow things are going to favor exporting them, because people, there's an old saying by Milton Friedman, which I shared on my page. I'm going to share it again. The funny thing about inflation is that we like to ask for the things that we buy to go down, but we always want the things that we sell to go up. Okay, so think about the maize farmer. They want the price of their maize to go up. They just want the price of their fertilizer to go down. Okay, that is what everybody means when they say inflation, because nobody out there is voluntarily asking for wage cuts. Nobody's asking for price cuts in the things they sell. If you sell tomatoes, you're not asking for the price of tomatoes to come down. If you sell onions, you're not pushing for the price of onions to come down. You do not want the price of the things you sell to go down. Your time. You don't want the wages you earn to go down. You want the price of the things you buy to go down, and you want the price of the things you sell to go up. Inflation for everyone, just not for me. That is the mindset of everyone, including the maize farmers. So if they're presented with an option to sell maize to somebody where the price of maize is going up 31% in a country, they're not going to sell it to Zambia, where maybe it's moving up 29%. Yes, but the price of food altogether is going up 35% into Malawi. Then they're more than happy to try and sell that maize into that country, because they'll make more money. Okay, like everyone else will want more money. You want them to be patriotic, but you don't want to sometimes take the hit yourself. So you have to try and think about this very carefully. You want your inflation to go down. So the best way we can do this is to create an overproduction of maize. And how do we do it? One, obviously, our adverse weather. That's a bit difficult to get around, but that comes from more commercial farming. We need commercial farmers to be going after maize production, not only subsistence farmers, because commercial farmers are 3 times more productive than subsistence farmers. In other words, the commercial farmers produce 3 times the maize per hectare than a subsistence farmer. And then 3, we need to make sure we structurally bring down the cost of fertilizer by introducing the organic fertilizer market to make sure that the food prices can be kept low here, but also can be pushed out. Our over can be pushed out so that we're all heavily competing for as much crop as possible to send into our neighboring countries who are increasing the cost of food somewhere to the tune of 53%, 30%. Even South Africa, who's got much lower general inflation than us, are battling with food inflation at 13.8%. So that's the inflation picture. I just wanted everyone to take a moment to understand and for us to try and deal with as a country. Right. Now, that being the story of food, today, my main thought in Mindset Monday, and I gave you my thought on the industry and the economy, my main thought today on Mindset Monday has to do with proficiency. Now, I want to quickly introduce this point because I've been harping on the point of proficiency for a little bit of time now. And the reason I've been harping on this point of proficiency is because I think that we have underestimated the importance of becoming very good at things. As many people are pursuing wealth, there's this big pursuit of wealth that people have. As people are pursuing wealth, and not always for nefarious reasons, people always think it's the love of money that's pursuing wealth. Now, I'll tell you one thing: people will tell you money is not evil. Loving it is. Okay. And don't let anyone fool you, because most of the people who will tell you having money is evil are mostly the people who want to take it from you. Being attached to it and loving it, that's where your problems will come from. But I want to talk about something that I started on God's Economy yesterday, and this is the path to proficiency. I've put this up for everyone. If you want to see it, please go to my page. It'll show you the path to proficiency. And the reason why proficiency is extremely important is this morning I was having a session reading on. I was having a session just doing my morning meditations and reading, and I came across something when I thought about the verse in Hebrews, which talks about focusing on the end and the fact that He's the author and the finisher of our faith. And in the devotional I was reading, it talked about something called focus on the finish line. And why I looked at this is because I thought about how does somebody focus on the finish line. In the image that came into my mind was a runner moving in a 100-meter race, and their ability to have laser focus on what is ahead of them, the finish line. This 100-meter sprint, they've got this laser focus on the finish line. And the reason they can focus so well on the finish line is because they have built a proficiency in the action they're taking to get to the finish line, that they no longer need to focus on it. And later on, the thought came to me as to how we get to that level of proficiency. And I thought about somebody driving a car. I thought about a person who's driving a car, and the first time they're learning how to drive a car, they're focused on where their hands are on the steering wheel, where the other hand is also trying to move the gears or switch gears if you're moving a manual, even if you're moving an automatic, where you are trying to manage your gears, how your feet are trying to balance together. All these things, your focus is not on the road. Your focus is on your feet and your hands, which are trying to move in a coordinated fashion, trying to get you to move forward. Okay. So when you are not proficient at something, your focus is always away from forward. Your focus is on your hands and your feet trying to move around. Imagine a 100-meter sprinter who does not look at the finish line, but is constantly looking at their feet, trying to see if their feet are moving properly. That person is not going to get to the finish line. What you've noticed about the 100-meter sprinters who get to the finish line, barring Usain Bolt used to turn around and brag to people, but he got so good that he could do that, is that their eyes are dead set on that finish line. Okay, their eyes are dead set on getting ahead to that finish line, and they're moving their bodies at paces that you can't imagine. Okay, at wind-breaking paces to try and get there. But the reason they can take their focus off their feet, now let's go back to the analogy of a driver. Think of now an experienced driver. How many experienced drivers, unless there's a problem with their gears or there's a problem that is shown with their steering wheel, how many experienced drivers look at the things they're doing? They don't. They can even start to have conversations. They can even start to change music. Why? Because they've become so proficient at driving through practice, they can now focus ahead. Okay, they can now focus on the journey ahead. And it's because through that time of practice, they have built something into muscle memory. And this is what I call the path to proficiency. You want to be able to build a career on something bigger than just the paycheck around it. But you want to be able to build something so big because that's where your value comes from. It comes from how big your journey and your intentions are going to be. And therefore, it'll give you that, it'll take that proficiency you have built and apply it to a need that is growing. So the first step I think everybody should try and find in their proficiency, because I talked about sharpening your axe. And the question I asked yesterday is which axe should you sharpen? And I'll give you two factors to look at. One, when you're looking at your skill set, is firstly, and I want someone to write this down in the comment section if you're actually listening to this. And somebody, if you got a question about it, please send it through to our team. But the first thing I want you to write down in terms of what you should be focused on, in terms of which proficiencies, is one, first, take a list down all the things you are naturally gifted at doing. I want you to list down the things you are good at. Okay, list down all the things you are good at doing. Just start by listing them down. No qualifier, just list them down. Okay, put a list of 1 to 20. It can be one thing, it can be two, it can be 20 things, but what are the things you are good at? Then the next question you have to ask is, out of those things, which ones are you exceptional at? Which ones can you compete with people at? Which ones can they find very few people at your level? Okay, are you confident enough to compete with people? Sure, you think you're good at something, but then can you enter into competition in that and be confident that you can stand a chance and you can win? That is being good at something, by the way. Okay, that is when you know you're exceptional at something, is when you know that you're strong enough to compete with others and you can do it confidently without ever having to hamper them or without ever having to stop them. You can do it by just taking them on because you're good enough. Okay, so that's the first filter. The second filter is which one of these exploit your natural talents? Which one of these exploit things that you were never taught, that you were naturally gifted in and you sharpened over time through practice? You didn't go to school for it. You weren't really taught it. Nobody told you how to do it. You were just good at it. Were you good at pattern recognition? Were you good at verbalization? Were you very good at expression? Are you a person who, when you speak, you capture the room? Are you a person who knows who can solve problems very easily? You catch on to problem solving very quickly. What are the things you learn very fast in comparison to other people, or you pick up very quickly, or things you can do very well without actually having to have too much teaching and intervention? That is what we call a natural gifting, your natural inclination. And then the most important thing of which skills to sharpen is which one of these can be applied to a problem that has very strong meaning to you as a person. Okay, so these are three things you want to try and fix. One, which one of the things, list the things you're good at. Now filter it down to the things you're exceptional at. Three, which one of these exploits your talents? And four, which one of these has a purpose driven to it? When you can narrow it down using those four filters, you can then find which of the axes you should be sharpening. And sharpening the axe, in other words, sharpening your talent, sharpening your skill, comes in some main ways. One, education. Get educated in what you're talented in. Get certificates, get training, whatever it is. Get educated and start reading up on that field. You cannot become good at something without knowledge in that area. Get educated. Knowledge gives you the power to make very good decisions in that area. It gives you the power to know what is changing. It gives you the power to know what to predict what is happening. Knowledge is extremely important. Read in that area, but do not just read. Reading only sharpens the axe by 10%. The 20% sharpening of the axe comes from interacting with other people in that area. Network amongst your local industry. Get a coach, get a mentor. This is stuff that will sharpen your axe up to 30%. So 10% of your axe sharpening will come from reading and studying. 20% will come from interacting, being mentored, networking, getting feedback from people who you work with, working with peers, working in teams, collaborating. That is an important part of getting it. And then 70% of your axe sharpening will come from implementation. Implementation by actually doing it. Okay, getting proficient in something, getting to your 10,000 hours of practice. And I'm going to get to the journey of proficiency just now over these next 9 minutes. I'm going to take you through it. But getting very good at it. So sharpen your axe. Now that you've selected the axe to sharpen, take it through the sharpening process. Study, network, implement. Okay, that is what you want to try and do. Okay, that is the journey you want to do it. Studying something gives you the courage to network with people in that industry. Networking plus studying gives you the courage to now try by yourself, and you will be able to get to that point. So filter and then take it through those main points. Okay, so motivation is mentorship is extremely important in order to do that. Now, the final part I want to now show you is what I call the path to proficiency. And the reason why this is important is once you are proficient, and I wanted to just quickly state this before I share this out, is once you are proficient at something, once you are very good at something, okay, the value that you have as an individual starts to exponentially increase, and therefore and your marketing expenses reduce. So when you're really good at something, if you're a good cake baker, people phone you. You don't have to put up as many adverts, or just a single advert gets a lot of attention. When you are just an individual who is very good at something, you don't have to market yourself and convince people as much. They actually wake up in the morning when that need arises and they come to you already ready to purchase. So when you are very good at something, so if you focus on becoming excellent at something and networking yourself around and making sure you build a good network and a good proficiency, what happens is that referrals and recommendations start to come to you at a much faster pace. A lot of people are willing to also open doors for you in collaboration. Through collaborations, they'll say, can you come and work with me because you're good in that area? And therefore, your exposure levels start to increase. You start to piggyback off their networks because you're proficient. The doors start to open for you. From people of influence, from people of proficiency, also since the doors start to open. I can tell you this for a fact. This happens to people when you become very good at something. Okay? You want to become very good at you want to become generally okay at everything, cool. No one's going to pick up the phone and call you first. But when you're excellent at something, a lot of the people who need that thing are going to pick up the phone and call you first before they call anybody else. Okay, because they would prefer you. It's only if you're too expensive or you're not the person they want, that's when they'll start to go to that's when they'll go to other people. But the reality is, if you are the person who is good and they can find a way to meet your need, then they will come to you first. Okay, so that's the first thing you have to really focus on. And two, so you don't have marketing expense. And two, because you're very good at it, you can do it very quickly. You can do it well. You can do it efficiently. You can do it almost effortlessly. You do it at a lower cost. So you spend less money and time trying to get people to buy from you, and you spend less money and time executing. So therefore, you are more profitable with your time when you utilize it in an area of proficiency, as opposed to trying to juggle around a lot of things you're kind of okay with. Okay, so find your area of proficiency. But how do we get there? Okay, so you've located this area of proficiency. Let's talk about the journey to get there. And this is why I keep saying, you really, especially if you're in your 20s, you really can only sharpen one axe at a time. You really can only sharpen one axe. So here's the journey, what we call the path to proficiency. And I want to take you through this in the closing minutes of today. Now, the path to proficiency is one that is rather difficult. And as I said, I've put this up for everybody, but this comes from training programs. This is various training programs that have been looked at in terms of the path to proficiency. And if you look very carefully, it goes through a few things that you have to look at. One, how many hours must you practice? Two, what is the supervision levels required over you? Three, what are the task variability? What task variability are you facing? What are you led by? What is going to lead your actions? What is your trigger action? What are you going to do as the trigger point? What is the action context? What is the decision structure? What is the engine of your development? What's going to make you better? What's your mental focus? What's your suitability? And what is this suitable for? And what is the probability of making a mistake in this area, so that you have to be vicious in terms of making mistakes or risk management? So if you look at the hours practice for a trainee, let's look at it for each of the levels. For you to become a trainee, okay, you need to get to 10 to 100 hours. And that is about your first month of doing something proficiently. Okay. That is about your first month of practicing something proficiently. I see we're dancing around when it comes to the screen here. That is about your first month of doing something proficiently. Now, when you look at an apprentice, this is a person who's now got a little bit more leeway. Okay, that is a person who's done 100 to 1,000 hours. In fact, let me go through each of them and the levels. When you're a trainee, when you started something, you need constant supervision. The tasks that you're doing are very predictable. These are routine actions. Okay, if you watch the Karate Kid, if you're my age and you watch the Karate Kid, you remember Daniel-san doing wax on, wax off with Mr. Miyagi. Before he taught him how to get into a fight scene, he actually taught him to do simple actions like rotating his hand, painting with a brush. These are very important actions that taught him how to do that. These were mechanical tasks. Now they seem important, they seem very boring, and they don't seem important, and they don't seem to be wonderful things. But the reality is those are the things you must master first before you try and get to the top levels. So it's going to be simple and straightforward actions. This is the phase where people start to say, "Ah, this is the boring part. The beginning of the journey is rather boring." Okay? Your trigger action is just to enact the instructions. You are led by strictly and simply written down instructions. Okay? And it's simple repetition. You're just doing things to learn to repeat it. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Your decision making is not wide arrays, it's binaries. Yes or no, left and right, up or down. Everything is based on simplified decisions. Okay, and you're doing this because you have to become competent at it. You have to become so good that you can do it with your eyes closed at one point, and you're almost trying to become a machine. Your focus is on getting the physical action right. What is the action I need to do? Is it speaking? Is it writing? Is it data collection? Is it making? What is this physical action? Is it screwing something in very quickly, like maybe you're learning how to fix tires? Whatever it is a physical action. Now, because you're focused on simplified actions and a single focus on an action, your risk of making mistakes becomes lower and lower, and also because you're under constant supervision. Now, in the next level, after you finished, you've graduated out of your 100 hours. It is now trying to get to 100 to 1,000 hours. This is between 1 month and 12 months. Now, you've gone from now constant supervision. Your supervisor is a little bit more comfortable with you, and they now start just periodically checking in on you, periodic reviews and feedback. Your tasks are getting a bit more variable, but they're slightly predictable. You're now focusing not on instructions, but the procedures. So, okay, this is how we do things here. I'm no longer giving you the single action. This is how we do things. I remember when I first started at the stock exchange, they put me on the data collection desk. And all I had to do was at 14 hours, make sure I collected data, okay, and put it into that daily report. That is a single action they made me focus on. Then they moved me into the communications parts of things, and they started to show me how procedures were working now. My focus switched to procedures, okay? And it becomes a bit more, the complexity it starts to rise, but it is under control. Now, your action is about now putting your personal theory into practice. What have you learned? Now put it into practice. You're no longer just repeating things. You're putting theory into practice. And now what you're seeing is that your decisions are not just yes or no. It's yes, not, maybe, slightly, could be. All of a sudden, there's a little bit more variables that you're seeing. And you have to now select the right variables. You're getting periodic skills appraisals. People are starting to look and say, you're improving because, okay, the skills are starting to improve. You're not becoming competent at just an action, but your general skills are starting to improve. And therefore, this is a person, you're looking now not just at a physical action, you're analyzing and you're calculating. That's a lot of what you're doing now. At this point at apprentice level, you're learning to engage with your environment by analyzing and calculating your actions, and you're becoming more systematic. This is the highest point where people make mistakes, because a lot of people think that they become very good at this point, but you're really just an apprentice. Okay, you're not a freewheeling master. Finally, let me just go quickly through the journeyman, which is the third level, which is 1,000 hours to 10,000 hours. This is 1 till 10 years. You're now operating under structural oversight. You're facing slightly unique. So when things get very complicated, you can escalate them, but you can manage a broad spectrum of things. You're now led by patterns and frameworks. Your complexities are ambiguous, but you can take action. At this point, your focus is to experiment. Before you just enacted instructions, then you evaluated outcomes. Now you're even experimenting with new things a little bit here. And you're working with known unknowns. You're doing trial and error and pattern discovery in order to make decisions. You're facing challenges. You're looking at the relationships between certain things that are variable, and you're trying to work between autonomous systems. This is an area where a lot of people give up, and the risk of failure and error happens the most. But finally, to get to the final era, when your axe is sharpened and people are able to look to you and come to you and call on your name, and you've built a strong reputation, often comes after the 10,000 hours point. Spend 10 years in an industry, and you obviously now you're supervising others. You can do the absolute unique things. You're the top person who people come with the problems no one else can solve. And by the way, when you're dealing with very unique situations, that's often where premium pricing is. If you can only do very predictable tasks or slightly predictable tasks, people pay you less. If you can do very unique tasks, people pay you more. Okay, you get paid more for doing very unique things, and you are led by principles more than instructions. So you can you can actually operate where there are no instructions, no procedures, no patterns and frameworks, operating solely with principles, and that is why people will pay you more. People who are led by instructions are paid less, procedures a little bit more, patterns a little bit more, but people who are led by principles are led by the most, because they can be given unstructured problems that people have. You're dealing with unknown unknowns. You're exploring the world. Now you're dealing with you're dealing with personalized problems. You're using your intuition and your instinct. You're applying skills not into books and theory. You're applying it into real world unstructured situations, which people are willing to pay a premium value for. You are working with principles and purpose now, and you're sustainable, and this is suitable for trying to deal with real world problems. And the risk of error really is much lower because you're very good now, because your proficiency is extremely high, and you have really brought this down to a very predictable outcome. So that is what I wanted to focus on as your path to proficiency. Please take a look at it on my page. I've put it up for everyone, and I know that we've gone into overtime here, but the main drive I wanted to get everyone's mind on is focus on becoming proficient. I don't know, we'll probably have it tomorrow, but focus on becoming very proficient at something. Okay, become very good at something, because that is the first path to making your money well. It's a lesson I've learned over the last 12 years. It's a lesson I hope many people start to pick up here. I know that we're telling people juggle so many things and you'll make a lot of money. No, you won't. Do something very well, and people who are willing to pay you much more, and a lot more people will queue up looking for you, and a lot of the people who are willing to pay you much more will come looking for you. Okay, that is the way the world works. But if you want to spend your time marketing, convincing people, trying to beg them to do business with you all the time, struggling through things, if you're struggling to increase your price, it mainly is a signal that you're doing things that you're not proficient in. So focus on your proficiencies. And because of that journey I just showed you, that's why you can't take up too many proficiencies at the same time. With that, I wish you all a wonderful day. God bless. See you all tomorrow. And we'll be back as we're talking about treasury, and we're talking more about wealth. Have a wonderful day. God bless.